Welcome to the She's Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Hi there, and thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. Whether you're new to the show or are a longtime listener, I do really appreciate you being with me today. These one-on-one conversations are with women who are challenging themselves on many levels. They are following their passions. They are listening to their gut, building businesses, making music, following their heart, and doing what they love. Today's guest is pretty much doing all of those things, by the way. These ladies are kind enough to sit down with me to share their stories about the paths they have taken. I personally find these conversations not only informative, but super inspirational. Hopefully you find value in these conversations as well. If you appreciate what I'm doing here, help bring the stories of these women to more people by joining me on Patreon. By supporting the show with a small donation, you're helping me cover some of the costs of producing this podcast, which includes the editing and the sometimes travel I do to meet with such a wide variety of guests. You are raising your hand and you're saying, yes, I want more of these, Beth. All you need to do is go to patreon.com/bebold. Patreon supporters help me bring these conversations to you and do so by becoming a patron for just $5 a month. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus audio content, have the ability to submit questions for me to ask guests, and ladies are invited to become a part of a private Facebook group. Okay, today's conversation is with Anastasia Allison. Anastasia is a woman of many talents and interests. Early in her career, she worked as a park ranger, which was a dream job for her, and then as a law enforcement officer for BNSF Railway. She had a near-death experience in a car accident, and that turned everything around for her. It was then that she stopped letting her fears get the best of her, and it was at that point that she opened up to new possibilities, including her work now as an entrepreneur with a very innovative yet much-needed product for women hikers. Now, fair warning that we dive right into a topic that isn't usually discussed publicly, but is at the core of her company, Kula Cloth. Oh, and to top it all off, she plays violin and she calls herself a musical mountaineer. And you're going to hear just a beautiful story about that. Anastasia Allison is a really thoughtful, reflective human being. And I know you're going to love this conversation with her. Gosh, it's almost like I don't even know where to start with you because one, I think we have so much in common to chat about. There's so many things there, but also you are doing a lot of really neat things. And I don't know, do you want to just dive into the Kula Cloth?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a really, it's an interesting product. And what I find so interesting about it is that I'm a shaker. And so for listeners, because you have no idea what we're talking about, when you go hiking and you pee as a woman, you have some options, apparently, which I didn't even know. I thought it was either toilet paper or you just shook dry.
Yeah.
But there's other options.
There are other options.
Yeah. And I actually looked up today pee cloth because I wanted to see, is that like a thing? And it's a thing. And most people carry like a bandana with them. Most women will carry like a bandana as their pee cloth, right? But you have another option. So could you first kind of describe, I know you do a lot of backcountry hiking. You're really out in nature quite a bit. So you have some exposure and some experience with this. Can you go into maybe a little bit warning for listeners, but can you go into some detail about what's wrong with using toilet paper, what's wrong with just kind of shaking dry, and then what the solution is to that?
Yeah. So I'm a former park ranger and also a backpacking instructor currently for a nonprofit here in Washington called Washington Outdoor Women. And as a mountaineer and a climber myself, I would go into these very fragile alpine environments and I was frustrated by how much toilet paper that I was finding just haphazardly discarded on the ground. And if you're somebody like me, you sort of notice the toilet paper, and not to get TMI, but if the toilet paper doesn't have poop on it, it's probably been left there by somebody who's peeing. And so that sort of led me to thinking that there's a lot of people that maybe just don't know.
And probably a woman too.
Yeah, I would say most likely. And a lot of it, it's not necessarily like I would never shame somebody for leaving toilet paper in the backcountry, because a lot of people literally just don't know. They think it's just going to dissolve. But in alpine environments, especially where the snow is covering up that landscape for a large portion of the year, or in desert environments in particular, it can take months or years for toilet paper to actually go away. It's not as biodegradable as we're all sort of led to believe, that it's just going to disappear.
Right, it'll just disintegrate.
And so I made a practice very early on of packing in and packing out all of my own toilet paper. And I started going on longer and longer trips. And if you are using toilet paper for all ways that you're using the restroom, and you go on a 9-day trip, that's a lot of toilet paper that you are bringing in and out. Now, the alternative that I had found up until that point was drip drying. And we all know how well that works. You sort of shake.
And cross your fingers.
Yeah, shake and cross your fingers. And then you shake a little bit more until you think, okay, I'm good. And then invariably you pull your underwear back up, and now you're left sort of feeling like a swamp for the rest of the day. And so I started doing a little bit of research into maybe some other options. And I came across this article about using a pea cloth. And I read an article about people using a bandana, and as sort of basically just to wipe off after you pee. And my very first thought, if I'm being completely honest, was that is disgusting. I would never do that. But like I mentioned earlier, I was a backpacking instructor, and I remember thinking, okay, I at least need to give it a try. And if it works, I could tell my backpacking students, hey, this is
Here's
a great
an alternative.
Exactly. Yeah. So I went out and I bought this ugly old scrap of microfiber. I bought it on Amazon, this blue, hideous piece of fabric. And I attached it to my backpack, and I started using it as a pea cloth. And immediately it was a game changer for me. All of a sudden, I cut down on the amount of toilet paper I was bringing in to the backcountry by more than half. And I wasn't having to pack out a ton of dirty toilet paper anymore. And I felt dry and clean and really just not disgusting. I think that if you are in the backcountry, you tend to be sort of humid or damp for long periods of time. It could increase the likelihood of like chafing. Keeping dry tends to just make you feel better, especially when you're wearing the same underwear for days and days at a time. I probably sound like the most disgusting person on the planet.
No, not at all. I think you're just being honest.
Yeah.
I think you're talking about something that people don't talk about.
Right. Well, and so my very first backpacking trip ever, it was in 2006. And I don't recommend this to anybody at all, but my first backpacking trip was to climb Mount Baker. And a man was planning this trip. And I still remember him. I called him to say, what do I need to bring for the trip? And he said, well, just pack what you'd normally pack for a backpacking trip and bring an ice axe and crampons. And I didn't have the heart to tell this man I had never been on a backpacking trip in my life. And I didn't know what to pack. And it seems obvious now, sort of looking back at that moment, but I didn't bring toilet paper because I think there was a part of my mind that thought that there was going to be a bathroom somewhere. And I am slightly ashamed to admit that I legitimately stole toilet paper from another person in the group. Like, not asked them for it, but like legitimately snuck into their pack and stole it because I was so embarrassed. Yeah. And I think had people been more open about hygiene and talking about this, and had it been more of a fun thing to talk about as opposed to me just feeling stupid and embarrassed, maybe I wouldn't have been in that situation. So in 2016, I was happily using my pea cloth in the Wind River Range of Wyoming. my husband and I did this incredible 9-day off-trail high route through the Wind River Range. And it had become a joke with a girlfriend and I to take photographs of my pea cloth in these beautiful places, just as a joke. I would send her a photograph of my pea cloth in the Wind River Range. Like, look how beautiful that is.
You mean just like kind of strewn out, like this beautiful bandana?
It was the
cloth. It was the
microfiber blue cloth, and I would set it up on my trekking pole, so it did not look good at all. And I was taking a photograph of it in this gorgeous environment, and it almost felt like this lightning bolt just came out of nowhere into my head. And it just said, why isn't that a piece of gear? I wish that looked cooler. I wonder if I could design that as a real piece of gear. And so the whole rest of the trip, I was thinking about this idea that I had. Like, I'm gonna make a legit pea cloth, and it's gonna be a real piece of gear. And at the time, I was a police officer, so I had gotten laid off from my park ranger job. I was now working as a railroad police officer.
I can't wait to talk about that. Yeah. But we'll save those questions.
Yeah. So I'm working as a railroad cop, and I come back to the real world from the backcountry, or maybe it's the other way around, but I come back to normal, quote unquote, normal life. And instead of being open to the possibilities of how I could create this product, I looked at all the things that I didn't know how to do. Like, I didn't know how to sew, and I didn't know how I could afford to start a company. And I had a lot of limiting beliefs around money and starting a business. And I basically just sort of killed the idea. And that was it. That was in 2016. And in the interim, I sort of was going through an early midlife crisis of figuring out my identity. I was looking down the barrel of patrolling railroad tracks for 29 years and really felt like that was not what I was meant to do, but I didn't know what I would do. I sort of looked at people doing these really, really cool things in the outdoor industry and thought, well, they just got really lucky. Here I am. I'm just stuck here, and I just have to accept it. In January of 2017, my mom and my husband and I were driving home from a snowshoe trip at Stevens Pass, and I was driving and our truck hit some black ice that I didn't see, and we spun into the path of an oncoming semi truck. Now, obviously, there's a very happy ending to that story because I'm sitting here, but that moment for me was such an awakening. Because in that moment of literally facing my own mortality, I experienced no fear. It was this sort of sense of surrealness in slow motion, but I wasn't afraid. And so I looked back at my life, and
so that truck ended up veering out of the way.
It did.
Right?
Yes, it did. And to this day, I honestly don't know how. The last thing that I sort of recall seeing, and like I said, it sort of feels like the whole thing was a blur. The last thing that I saw was the cab of the truck about to impact the side of my husband's car, or the passenger side door, and nothing happened. There was no impact. And when we came to a stop, we were literally blocking both lanes of the oncoming traffic. So we had spun from the eastbound lane, or we had spun from the westbound lanes, and we are now completely blocking the eastbound lanes of Highway 2. And so to this day, I have no idea how that truck missed us. It kept going.
Did he stop?
No, he didn't. It kept going. And so we were literally just sitting there in the middle of the highway wondering, like, what just happened?
Was the oncoming traffic then stopped?
Luckily, it was like a Monday. And so there was very, very little traffic. There was a few cars coming, but basically I just sort of we just sat there for a few minutes, and then I put the car had a hard time going back into drive because of the spinning, I think, but we were eventually able to get it going again and drive home. And honestly, I went home and I think I cried for about 2 weeks, and it felt, I think the the thing that hit me the most was that, like I said, in that moment, I wasn't scared, but then I looked at my own personal life and all the things that I wanted to do or dreams that I wanted to pursue. And I realized that it was fear that was preventing me from going after any of those things. And I sort of asked myself, well, hey, if you aren't afraid in this literally critical moment, then what are you afraid of in the rest of your life? And is it possible that the fears that you are allowing to sort of keep you locked in place and allowing you to sort of be paralyzed exactly where you are, is it possible that you're just manufacturing those in your own head? And the answer to that was definitely yes.
What were your fears?
It was a lot around money, a lot around disappointing others. I realize now that I spent, I would say, the majority of my life seeking affirmation from others. So trying to do things that I thought would make other people happy, which was mostly based on their fears of wanting to protect me. So I don't think that there was anybody ever out to sabotage my life or try to prevent me from living my dreams. I think that people who give you guidance in your life usually have very, very well-meaning. And I look back on that and I'm really grateful for those people.
Was it like your family, you mean?
Yeah, I would say that like my dad came from an era that was based very much on scarcity and lack. And so he had a lot of beliefs around like money and starting a business and then just things that people say. You, as a business owner now, I listen to what people say a lot, and people will say things like, well, all businesses always fail, or you'll never make a profit in your first 3 years as a business owner. Mm-hmm. And you're going to struggle being an entrepreneur, or it's so lonely being an entrepreneur. Like, and if you believe those things, it will happen.
Right.
You know, and that's what it has been this total mindset shift for me, where the whole process of creating Kula has been this process of sort of almost reverting to childhood a little bit. Because when you're a kid, I think that you are just naturally tuning in to your intuition and like following these little impulses to sort of like lead you to the things you want to create in your life. And then as adults, we sort of start to shape what we do to please others as opposed to listening to this internal guidance. And so for me, the process of sort of rediscovering myself has been a process of actually listening to myself again and trusting my internal guidance and my intuition and going towards things that maybe feel a little bit unknown and just trusting that it's all going to work out. So I ended up leaving my police job in 2017, July of 2017, and this idea of the P cloth, it came back up again. It was not called Kula Cloth back then. It was just this idea, and I felt like all of a sudden I didn't have any fear about pursuing it. You know, I'd figure out the money, I'd figure out how to do everything with starting a company. I didn't know how to sew, but I knew how to make a phone call. And that's something most of us know how to do. We also know how to use Google. So I called a friend who knew how to sew and I explained what I wanted to do. And she said, you need a serger and I have an extra one and I'll loan you one. So I started buying fabric.
What's a serger?
It's a type of a sewing machine, and you can use it to sew together different types of fabric. So for Kula Cloth, my initial idea was to take waterproof fabric and sew it together to absorbent fabric. And so I needed this specific machine to sew it together, basically. I don't know much about sewing still. I can sew a mean square now.
That's all you need.
That's all I need. The very first Kula ever did not look like a square. It looked like an amoeba. But I just kept practicing, and my husband would be at work and I would be in our guest room sewing for hours, sewing squares, just practicing and trying to get these prototypes right. And finally, I sort of had something that looked squarish enough that I was confident in it. And I began giving them to friends to test. And then I started getting input back from people about what they wanted to change with the product and what could I improve. And then I sort of got to the point where I was making prototypes that actually looked sort of okay. And people started wanting to buy them. And so I started selling these little prototypes. And in the interim, I knew that I did not want to be the manufacturer of these products. I don't have sewing equipment. I do not have the skill set to professionally produce a product at this scale. And I didn't know how to find a place that would make a product for me. So back to Google I went, and I found myself Googling things like, how do you find a place that sews stuff for you? That was literally my first Google search. And I finally came across a manufacturer in Pennsylvania, told them what I wanted to do. And then in the interim, I had sort of finally narrowed down the fabric I wanted to use and figured out that I could have 2 different types of fabric actually bonded together and have it custom printed with like beautiful prints. And so it was, I think the coolest part of it is that all the answers sort of came and found me. It feels like it just happened really effortlessly because I believed it was possible and I didn't try. I mean, I did. I did a lot of work and sort of eat, sleep, breathe, dream, trying to figure this product out. But I think the thing that I love the most about it is like at every single solitary moment when I needed it, the right person would just sort of show up with the answer. And I launched the company in July, I believe it was July 20th of 2008. I believe. I launched it with a pre-sale to try to help fund the very first run of custom fabric because I had to buy 100 yards of fabric, which if you've ever bought 100 yards of a custom printed, double bonded, it's like thousands of dollars.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, my fabric is thousands and thousands of dollars just for 100 yards. And when your product is only 5.5 by 5.5 and you buy 100 yards of fabric,
you better get working.
Yeah, it's going all in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so my pre-sale started and I sold 850 Kulas in my pre-sale.
Oh my gosh.
And I've been off to the races ever since.
Amazing.
And it is a really simple, tiny little product that it looks simple. You hold it, you just think, oh, well, it's a square. How hard could that have been to figure out? Mm-hmm. And every tiny little piece, every spot where there's a snap installed, the length, the width of the label, like every single solitary thing was a decision. And that's been the fun part. I have no design experience. I have no textile experience whatsoever. And watching the product come to life, and now it is literally shipped all over the world. I mean, thousands and thousands of them have been shipped all to people all over the world. And that is mind-blowing to me.
It is mind-blowing.
It's so cool.
So for listeners, I want to describe this a little bit. And you did a great job of it. But for somebody who like has absolutely no idea, I'm lucky enough to have one in my hand, so I can actually physically see it. But it kind of looks like a pot holder in that but just maybe a little bit smaller.
It's a little smaller.
Yep. So kind of looks like a pot holder, a square pot holder with a little loop on the end, just like you might see with a pot holder. Mm-hmm. But as you said, when you say it's bonded, the neat thing about that, because I want to explain that, it just means that it's almost like they're waffled together.
Correct.
So they're not going to separate. So the 2 pieces, the antimicrobial piece on one side and the cloth on the other side, the decorative cloth. Is that a good way to describe that?
Yeah, it is. And that side, so there's basically the antimicrobial absorbent side, and then there's a waterproof print side.
Perfect.
And then there's essentially there's like a membrane in between those two, so that when you are using the antimicrobial absorbent side to sort of pat dry after you pee in the woods or wherever you happen to be, you aren't going to get your hand dirty. And that was one of the things that I found while using my ugly blue scrap of microfiber is you don't know what side you've used.
Exactly.
So you're just touching it all day long.
Right. And you have no idea.
You have no clue. And then you also can't keep it clean because there's no way to enclose it. It's just sort of, so anytime you set your pack down on the dirt, you're laying this piece of fabric down in the dirt. And I'm a gear person. I love gear. I backpack and mountaineer all the time. And I realized that I was spending $500 on a tent without blinking an eye. But then the one thing that I'm literally putting in contact with the most sensitive part of my body, it looks like I pulled it out of a rag bin at Jiffy Lube. And it was disgusting. And so, and then I thought, I know that I was squeamish the first time I heard the idea of a pea cloth. And I remember thinking, I wonder if this was intentionally designed, if other people out there who sort of have that initial squeamish reaction, if they'd be more open to trying it. And the answer to that has definitely been yes, because it feels clean. It doesn't feel disgusting. And it's actually sort of freeing to have it on the trail and to have your hygiene not be something that you're worried about.
Yeah. And I think such a big part of that is just having the conversation because people don't talk about it. You know, I will tell you this. I'm doing this race, I think I probably told you, in Namibia in April. And it's self-supported. So I have to carry everything for 7 days, what I'm going to use for 7 days. And that includes 7 days worth of toilet paper. Now, the description that I have from the race directors is bring 7 days worth of toilet paper. What does that even mean? I have no idea. There's no guideline for what that means. Like, I get it. It's going to be different things to different people. So there's that. And then there's no information about, and bring a plastic quart size or whatever liter size bag to put your toilet paper in. There's no discussion of that.
To pack it out.
Yes. So what I'm excited to do is to actually post a photo of the Kula Cloth. I'll have to ask the race directors if it's cool first, but I want to post in our Facebook group and say, hey, here's an alternative, that if they'll allow it. I'll bring toilet paper also, but if they will allow it, then that would be a great thing for the women competitors to use.
It is. I have so many ultra runners who use a product, and when I first created Kula, I think I had this sort of tunnel vision for backpackers and hikers because that's what I sort of identified with, was that sort of realm of adventuring.
And who the hell's going to run so long that they might have to go take a pee
right,
in the middle
exactly.
of it, right? That's what most people, sane people, would think, because you wouldn't ever be out on the trail that long.
But ultra runners, and then as Kula has grown, I have paddlers who use Kula. I have boat owners who use Kula. I have RVers. I have people who live in their vans. I even have people who now have switched over to using Kula entirely at home. Because they want to just cut down on waste. And so it's been really cool to watch the product take on a life of its own and to sort of see people's eyes light up a little bit when they start to get it. And then also when they try it for the first time. I had a woman reach out to me very early on, and she told me she had never peed while hiking ever.
Oh my God.
She just held it.
Oh gosh.
And she actually limited her hikes, the length of her hikes, because she was so uncomfortable with this idea of peeing in the woods. And she sort of described this experience of having the Kula on her hike, and that it was all of a sudden, it was like this whole new world was opened up for her. And I think there was a part of me that knew that would happen with the product when I sort of introduced it, but hearing those stories from people whose adventures have been a little bit more comfortable as a result of it is sort of the why of why I do this, because Kula it's a piece of gear, but I look at gear as a vehicle for this deeper level of self-connection that we can make when we're out in the wilderness. And if somebody's being prevented from connecting with themselves on that level due to a fear around hygiene or a worry around hygiene, well, then how can we make the wilderness more accessible to people who have those fears? Because I really feel like the more people that are spending time outside, the better off the rest of the planet is.
Absolutely.
And so I feel like that's sort of Kula's role in all of this is just being a vehicle for people to get outside and have those experiences.
Yeah. Well, good for that woman for still going out and hiking, because I think a lot of people just wouldn't do something because of that. So two things I want to just kind of go back to that description just so that people know. So once it's been used, as you said earlier, you can actually fold it up, and there's a couple of clips there that you just snap it together, and then it almost looks like a half a sandwich.
It does,
and then,
exactly.
Right. So then you don't have that just hanging off your pack, with being exposed. So that's a really nice feature. And the other feature that I thought was really cool is that, as you described to me earlier, was that it's got this stitching on it that is, what did you call the stitching?
It's a reflective thread.
Yeah.
So it is a retro-reflective thread. And I realized that when I was using my random scrap of blue fabric as a pea cloth, I would wake up at 2 a.m. when I'm backpacking and have to pee. And I usually would hang that up in a tree somewhere just to sort of air out if I'd washed it off. And I could never find it. And so, as somebody who spends a lot of nights in a tent, I realized that having some sort of a reflective aspect was really important so that people could locate the product at night. And that reflective thread is so cool. It glows like a beacon. It's pretty funny, actually.
I mean, that is such a neat feature to it.
Yeah.
Like, who thinks of that?
Right? I lost a lot of sleep.
Yeah. It's a great feature for sure. The other thing that I wanted to bring up too is that I know you had been to Bhutan. What year did you go?
I went to Bhutan in 2011.
Okay, so it was a while ago, which is a good thing because I want to describe something. I started going to Bhutan in 2008, and back then, when there's one main road that goes across the country. And back then there was no place to stop for a toilet break. Like we had to go on the side of the road. Now they've got these restaurants and kind of tea houses and little cafes and stuff that are about every hour and a half, 2 hours or so, which is awesome. But back then we were constantly having to just stop and pull over, on the side of the road. And something like this would have been great. So even for travel, you don't think of it. I think a lot of people don't realize that there are still very remote places in the world where you can't just pull over at a gas station, and go to the local 7-Eleven and go use the restroom. So for remote destinations, that is a good thing as well.
Yeah, I have so many people who have done Everest Base Camp treks or just treks in Asia, even just urban traveling.
I can imagine
in Asia.
Doing the Camino, doing these long
The
walks.
Camino is actually, I probably get at least one message a week from somebody who's doing the Camino telling me that they've either used a Kula or they're about to use a Kula. And then I'll get messages saying there's so much toilet paper on the Camino. You need to hook up with these trekking companies in the Camino and start offering the product. And then Kilimanjaro is the other place that I've heard. I've never personally been, but I know that there's a lot of toilet paper in the Mount Kilimanjaro area. And so I've got a lot of people who've used the product on Kilimanjaro as well. So it's neat to see it becoming a little bit of a paradigm shift. One of the things when I started Kula that I really envisioned was that I envisioned just every backpack out there that could possibly have a Kula on it, that it would have a Kula on it, and that this would just be like this totally normal thing where sort of like an essential piece of gear, like your first aid kit or your headlamp or whatever it is.
Or a whistle comes with the backpack.
Exactly. Like it would just be something that people had. And I feel like the more that I continue to focus on that and sort of feel the excitement of that, I really do see it happening and spreading, and I see people getting really excited about the product.
Well, you're just normalizing it.
Yeah.
You're normalizing the fact that we have to pee, which is just, like I said, just people, it's just something that people don't talk about. So
right.
That's a great thing.
Yeah.
Huge
I
step.
love doing it.
Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
What I'll do is I'll post a photo in the show notes so people can see it there and link to all your
and I'll give
you
I'll give you some good photos, and I can even give you like a little product photo too.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Gosh. Okay. Thanks for that deep dive into the Kula Cloth. Kula, just so people know.
Yes.
If they want to Google that, they can find out more. So, gosh, I feel like there's so much to kind of unravel now because there's so many other parts of who you are that I'm really interested in. So I kind of want to go back in time and talk about that. Did you grow up in the Pacific Northwest?
I did not. I grew up on the East Coast. I was born in Florida, then lived in Alabama, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Maryland.
Why?
So my dad worked for the federal government, and so he moved quite a bit.
What did he do?
So he worked for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was a former reactor operator on a nuclear submarine for the Navy.
Oh my goodness.
So the NRC is essentially the governmental agency that regulates nuclear plants and goes and inspects them and makes sure that they're safe. And so that's what my dad did. And so we moved around a lot as kids.
So wait, you said something about a submarine.
He was in the Navy as well.
Okay, so he was in the Navy, but then once out, then he was with the NRC.
Yep.
Okay.
So we moved around for that.
Did you enjoy that as a kid?
I did not like moving. I recall not being happy moving from North Carolina to Pennsylvania. Did you really like North Carolina? I loved North Carolina. I had a yard, our backyard in North Carolina had a stream in it, and it was just the perfect sort of backyard for this very adventurous kid like me. We moved to Pennsylvania, and I was very different, I think. I had a Southern accent and really, really short hair, and I looked like just this little tyke. And
how old were you then?
I think I was 10 or 11. And so that's an awkward age to be a new kid with a Southern accent. And so I was bullied pretty significantly between, I would say, grades 5 through 7. And was very unhappy in school.
Was it the accent?
I think it was the accent, and I was different and sort of thought I was Huckleberry Finn. And
sorry to interrupt you there.
No.
Just a quick side story. I was born in Atlanta, and my family was from the South. So like my extended family, my parents and my extended family are from the South. And so we moved to New Jersey when I was 4, and I had a slight accent. And just from 4 years there and then being around a family that had a Southern drawl, I got teased by my teachers in first grade. Isn't that incredible just to think that? Yeah. But they would tease me. And I'm sure that that's why today I don't, like a lot of people will tell me, I do have some Jersey in me, but a lot of people will tell me that I don't have an accent. And I think I got accents drummed out of me because of that. It's like really traumatizing.
It was very traumatizing for me as a kid, and I was simultaneously playing a lot of music. So I started playing violin when I was 4. I was in a violin group going through into middle school. And finally, when I was in 8th grade, my mom decided to pull me out of school, and I ended up being homeschooled from 8th through 12th grade.
Because of the experience.
Yeah, because of the bullying. It was to the point where I was sort of non-functioning in school, just sort of coming home crying and not really doing much.
What years?
So I was 12 years old when I finally was pulled out of school.
And what year was that actually?
Oh, that would have been in 1992. I believe. I was born in 1980.
Okay. I'm the math that I'm trying to do, or kind of the calculation that I'm trying to do, is that I'm wondering if that was a time for bullying, but no one did anything about it, And it's also, that's an early time for homeschool. That it just, I mean, now I know so many people who homeschool, but back then it's not a popular thing.
It was very new and sort of considered newfangled and crazy to be homeschooled, but I loved it. And we did a lot of field trips. I volunteered for a national park in Pennsylvania called Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site, which I think honestly was sort of the start of me discovering my love of national parks. and we went on a month-long camping vacation to all the national parks in the West.
You went with both of your parents?
Yep, with both my parents.
I didn't know how much with your dad's work, if that took him away.
He didn't do a lot of the schooling, but when we would go on, we would usually go on at least like a 4 or 5 week vacation every year.
That's a
which
big
was pretty
deal.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was very, very fortunate that I was able to, I think the homeschooling sort of allowed me to have this very adventurous, sort of self-run childhood almost. And I'm really glad that even amidst the bullying that happened, I never really lost myself completely. While I definitely think that I probably started down the path of seeking others' affirmations at that point in my life, I would still do crazy things like ride a unicycle and dress up like Huckleberry Finn. And so I didn't totally lose myself in it.
Yeah, but there's some recognition in doing something different that is also kind of approval seeking.
Yes.
Don't you think?
I think so. Yeah, I do. And I think that there was a part of me that wanted attention, any type of attention, but it was sort of like, was it negative or was it positive? It didn't matter to me. If I was getting some sort of attention, then I was doing something right. Mm-hmm. And I was definitely seeking that from outer sources that were not from within myself. So I was either seeking affirmation and approval from my parents or from the school or from the kids who hated me. Whatever it was basically from everywhere except for within myself. And so I think I had a lot of ideas during that time. And I look back and I was a very entrepreneurial kid. I was always running little businesses and starting little businesses. I started a juice delivery business, which I look back on that. Had I kept that going, I'd probably be a billionaire right now.
You probably would.
But I stopped it because I thought it was dumb or, thought like, oh, this is just a silly whim of a child. Uh-huh. And But I just loved this variety and the excitement of like having an idea and following it and then watching it sort of unfold in an interesting way. I did not think that was responsible for a career because of just things I had picked up along the way that I believed. And so your dad has a very stable or had a very stable job, government job. Yes.
That's pretty serious stuff. And especially in the nuclear field, right? So
very, very stable. And so this idea of stability and responsibility and was very, very much drilled into a part of who I was. Like if you didn't have a steady paycheck coming in, something was wrong and you needed to figure that out very quickly.
Did your mom work?
She did for part of my childhood. So I'm one of 3 girls. And so when we were being homeschooled, she was home with us. And then I had another sister who actually had Lyme disease. And so she was very ill.
Wow. Also another thing that like very early on, like relatively recent, like Lyme is relatively recent. So she got that really early on when there was there was almost nothing that you could do. And in fact, they gave her steroids because they didn't know that it was Lyme disease. And that actually made it worse. So she was home sick for several years. And so there was sort of a lot of turmoil, I guess, in my life as a child. I think that also goes back to the sort of looking for some sort of affirmations and approvals, because when you're the sibling of a very, very ill child, you are not getting attention. And that's totally understandable. Like, is she older or younger?
She's younger than me. So I'm the oldest of 3. Mm-hmm. And so that was definitely sort of a traumatic few years for our family. And all the while, I think I was just sort of trying to find my way in all of this. And I kind of look back now and see how those things have shaped me into where I am. And it's turned out to be a really great thing, of course. I think that's the only way that you can look at it. But at the time, it was definitely sort of a struggle fest. And now I feel as though I can look back on those moments and sort of see where they were leading me the whole time. And I think that's nice.
What makes you so reflective? Like, I don't think everyone kind of analyzes their life and thinks about key moments or what's influenced them. What led you to that?
I think, honestly, the whole journey of creating my own career with Kula and leaving my police job, I really sort of swallowed this sometimes bitter pill of basically saying that I'm the one who creates my own reality. And so through that, I had the experience of looking back on these key moments in my life and sort of asking myself, what was my role in this particular situation? And if you really believe that you are the one creating the things that you want in your life, that means that you also created the things that you didn't want in your life.
You have to take responsibility.
You have to take responsibility for them. And so it's not to blame myself or say that I'm going to give people a pass on treating me badly, but it's looking back and sort of asking myself, what was going on in my life at that moment that my point of attraction, like that I was so focused on what I didn't want, that I was literally just calling in more of what I didn't want. And I can look back on that, and it's actually really powerful for me to do that, because you can look at something horrible that happened in your life and say, whoa, I actually do take some responsibility for this, at least on some level, because of what was going on in my life at this time. I was really, really focused on what I didn't want. And I can see where that sort of unfolded into this situation that I didn't like. I can look at that now and say, okay, that was great and it sucked. And I know that I don't want to do that again. So from where I am right now, what can I do to focus on all the things that I want in my life? Like if I could create really bad things, that means that I could create really amazing things. And so now I've just shifted my focus. I don't sit around and think about what I don't want anymore. I think about all the things I want. And I really feel that the key to creating anything you want in your life is finding the feeling of what you want to create now, and then sort of allowing yourself to discover those answers along the way. Like all the things that have come into my life through Kula and through everything that I have the opportunity to do now, I haven't gone out looking for them, which is usually coming from a place of lack and a place of needing things to be different. I've focused on finding this really wonderful feeling of abundance and love within myself. And then things that match that feeling just come to me so naturally now. And I'm like, whoa, anybody can do this. We just don't know that we can do it, I think.
Do you think it's a matter of just being aware? Like you said, things have just kind of come so easily. Do you think it's a matter of just being aware of those things?
Yes.
Like they were there, but you didn't recognize that they were there.
Yes. I think it's 100% awareness. I think anybody can flip the switch at any moment. And if all of a sudden you say to yourself that you're open to possibilities and that you can create anything you want, and you just didn't know that before, so you can't blame yourself for where you were, and you just sort of find gratitude for where you are now and feel the things that are coming into your life. And when you can allow it to be easy, then it happens. If you believe that something's going to be really difficult and hard to achieve, then that's what you'll find too. And so it's just sort of asking yourself, like, what do you want to find? I like things to be easy because it's a lot more fun that way for me. And I find that I'm just a lot happier. And I do see a lot of entrepreneurs that struggle a lot, and they talk about the struggle a lot. And I find that very interesting too, because I don't talk about that and I don't have a struggle. And so it's sort of this really neat thing to watch.
It's what you talk about comes to fruition.
It does.
I talked to someone recently for the podcast, and I won't say who it was for a specific reason, but she had just come off an injury, and she had said to me, I don't want to talk about this. Actually, it's happened several times where there's been some event and the guest has said, I don't want to talk about this. And at first I was like, oh, that's kind of a bummer because I'd like to explore that. And then I realized, you know what? I do the same thing. It's that we choose the words that come out of our mouths. Mm-hmm. And if we choose to tell a story that happens to have something negative attached to it, then it breathes life into it. And then the person that you've told that story to identifies you with that. And what I've noticed is if I do tell a negative story, then I don't see a person for a month, they're still holding on to that. And then they say, oh, Beth, how was that? Whatever. And I was like, oh, that was gone the next day. That wasn't an issue the next day. That was just like whatever was fleeting in my head that afternoon. And then by that night, I was over it.
Yeah.
So yeah, we just breathe life into that stuff.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong. I mean, we will all experience things that we don't want and negative emotions. Like that's obviously part of life. And I tend now in the past, I would have grabbed onto that and just run down the rabbit hole of worrying and being fearful and like running through imaginary scenarios in my head and playing the what if game and getting into arguments in my head that weren't even real. And, oh, I won that argument. And it's not even a real
in the shower.
Yeah. And I would be so in my head that I literally am creating the energy of what I don't want. And I usually tell people to imagine yourself as a satellite beacon. So you're constantly just sending this little signal out to the world saying, show me more of this, show me more of this. And what you're focused on is what you're going to get shown. And so just ask yourself a simple question. What am I focused on? And then look at your life. You can see what you're focused on by what is showing up in your life right now. And if you don't like it, then what would you prefer? And you just start focusing on what you would prefer and how excited you are for that to happen. And you don't need to know how it's going to happen, but just start thinking about it and getting excited about it and being open to possibilities. And all of a sudden, these incredible little things are going to start to happen because you're starting to be led to moments that are going to match up with this new feeling inside of yourself, as opposed to the feeling of, I'm going to just rehash this horrible situation for the rest of my life and make that my foundation. Nobody wants that.
Have you done therapy?
So I have gone through therapy, like as a I guess a patient. I was in therapy for, I would say, a few years. It was all revolving, I would say it was revolving around a past relationship. There was some definite like codependency issues in my family. I have a sister who had struggled with an eating disorder, and that was something that was really, really difficult for me to personally deal with. So just there was sort of a whole bunch of things. And then as a railroad police officer, I unfortunately had to handle, I think it was 16 or 17 pretty horrific fatalities. And so I had a lot of trauma from like PTSD. And so I was in therapy for several years, and I sort of got to the point where it was like I was about to leave my police job and I was feeling really, really good, actually. And I ended up transitioning from the therapist. I felt like I was sort of done talking about my problems. And I ended up transitioning to seeing a coach. And that was a total game changer for me. I would never diss therapy because I definitely feel like it was really life-changing for me in difficult situations. But when I switched to the coach, all of a sudden I was looking forward, not thinking about what I didn't want all the time, which seemed to aggravate those wounds a lot. But now all of a sudden I was thinking to the future and like, what do I want to create for my life? And seeing that coach totally changed my life. In fact, changed my life so much that I actually ended up going through the same training that she went through because it was so, I mean, I could not imagine my life today had I not sort of done that. And I'm definitely somebody who would not have ever hired a coach because I thought it was like, oh, that's frivolous. Like, who needs a coach for life? I'm like, apparently I did.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that, and not to take anything away from what you had said, but just kind of what I was reading into it, because you could definitely have these ideas on your own, but you actually, it seems like you've done like a really deep dive on yourself.
Yes.
And like that you really understand yourself well.
Yes.
And that usually only comes from, just like off the top of my head, it comes from either going to therapy and kind of working that stuff out, coaching, working with a coach, or just reading a lot of books and kind of understanding.
I've done all three.
Yeah, that's great. Like,
Yeah.
I think getting to know yourself, I think, is the number one. I think that should be our number one goal. I think that we just don't pay enough attention to why we do things, and we don't pay attention to the voices in our head and the conversations that we have when no one's around.
Yeah, that aren't real.
Yes.
And I think for me, this sort of idea of awakening to the fact that the stories that I was so identified with the thoughts in my mind, like, this is who I am. And I have since read so much, and I do a lot of meditation and have experienced so much understanding on a deep level of what each of us is, I think, sort of beyond that facade of our ego and our thoughts, that it's been really, really eye-opening. And I think you can have a lot more empathy for yourself that way. And I think you can look at others and have a lot more empathy for them, because you can see them when they're in those patterns. And instead of getting personally offended by it, especially as a business owner, this is so huge. Instead of getting personally offended when somebody writes you a nasty message or whatever it might be, you can sort of see through that and offer some empathy to that person, because you know that they've got a struggle going on in their mind.
Right. And those kinds of things are always about the other person more than they are about you.
They are.
Mm-hmm. So just to get back to your story, because I can't wait to talk to you about your police officer work. That's like all going to culminate in that, because I'm really fascinated with the kind of work that you were doing. So you found this love with with national parks and with the outdoors, which through your homeschooling kind of allowed you to explore that stuff, which is really cool. And you've had this adventurous streak since you were young. What got you into the National Park Service as a ranger?
So I was a volunteer for the National Park Service, and then I ended up I was a ranger for Washington State Parks. I applied for a police academy.
Was that when you were still on the East Coast?
Nope, it was out here. Well, so I was living on the East Coast. I was working at a print shop and really sort of trying to figure myself out. And I was volunteering at the national park and on weekends. And I was sitting there one day, and the superintendent said to me, "Anastasia, what do you want to do with yourself?" And I said, "I just want to do this all the time. I just want to," and at the time I was playing my violin at the national park. I was dressed in like 1830s clothes with a bonnet on, like doing living history. So, and he said,
were you getting paid for that?
Oh, no. Nope,
okay.
All volunteer.
And this was all your idea. Like, hey, I play violin.
Yeah. Oh, I've been doing it since I was 12.
Oh my goodness.
So I was a volunteer at this specific national park for almost 12 years.
Wow.
And did living history there. And I don't know why it took me so long to figure this out, but all of a sudden thought, oh my gosh, why am I not a park ranger? I had actually been pre-med in college, and I was struggling with the idea of going to med school or not. And so I ended up deciding I'm going to apply for a police academy to become a park ranger, because at the time it was relatively close to 9/11, and the National Park Service did not have any money for
it was after 9/11.
It was after 9/11. So they didn't have money for interpretive rangers, but they had money for law enforcement rangers.
So you actually have to go through law enforcement to be a park ranger?
If you are a law enforcement ranger. So
okay.
There's different types. So the law enforcement rangers are commissioned police officers basically within the parks and carry a gun and just like a normal cop, but you're working in a park. Mm-hmm. And so I went through a police academy, and the police academy ended up being here in Washington. So I moved out to Washington for 4 months to attend this police academy, fell in love with the state. I ended up not hiring. The National Park Service at that time was not hiring full-term positions. It was only these seasonal jobs, but the state parks was hiring permanently. And so I ended up applying for a job with the Washington State Park System, and I became a park ranger at a small park on the Hood Canal called Tawana State Park. And I worked down there for about 7.5 years until I was actually laid off. So in Washington, in around the 2011 era, we had that budget crisis, and the Discover Pass was sort of enacted in state parks, and there was this huge...
As a way to get money.
Exactly.
Right? Mm-hmm.
And about 100 park rangers were laid off, and I was one of them. And it was kind of traumatic for me because that had really been my identity for so long, was this park ranger. It was sort of this childhood dream coming true. And all of a sudden I didn't have it anymore. And in the interim, I had sort of panicked. I actually, sort of ironically enough, I had just gone to Bhutan. I came back from Bhutan and was literally told the day I got back from Bhutan that I was going to be getting laid off from my job. So it was this very tumultuous time for me.
So you probably went to Bhutan, had this unbelievable experience, because it is like one big national park there.
Yes.
It is so beautiful. So I can only imagine.
It was crushing. I came back and I was in, I would say, a relatively deep depression for months. I mean, just like it just felt like a weight was on my shoulders all the time. And I actually sort of looked into going back to Bhutan as a expatriate to teach violin. And I got an offer to do that. And this sort of goes back to my limiting beliefs around money. But I think somebody said, well, how are you going to pay your car payment? And I couldn't figure that out. And so I said no to the Bhutan job. And because they were only going to be able to pay me $100 a month or something. Mm-hmm. Looking back on it, I sort of want to smack myself because I'm like, you could just sold the car, dummy. But that's okay. So I sort of panicked and again, had all these adventurous ideas, but did not know what to do. I was very much lost in what I call the how. Like, I don't know what to do. I have all these ideas, but I don't know how to make it a thing. And I'm in law enforcement right now. So I guess that's all that I can do is go back into law enforcement. So I ended up seeing a job with BNSF Railway for a special agent position. And I thought, well, that's cool because I don't really want to be a normal like city or county cop, but railroad cop sounds kind of cool. So I applied for that job and got it. And I was the first female railroad police officer in the Seattle area in over 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
So it was pretty cool. And
where were you stationed?
So no
pun intended.
I was in the Seattle area. So the Seattle team for BNSF Railway Police covers huge territory, basically from, I would say, down in Olympia all the way up to the Canadian border, and then also out to Stevens and Stampede passes. So huge, huge territory. Everett, Seattle, Tacoma, Bellingham, Mount Vernon, all these towns have railroads in them. And I got to patrol all of them.
So what did you do? Did you hop on in Olympia and take the train north or drive to these places?
I had a car. So I had a police Tahoe, big black and white police Tahoe, and I would drive around to sort of various spots. And one of the biggest issues that we had in Washington is trespassing, because most of our train tracks are right along the water in these beautiful areas. And most people don't know that it's actually private property on railroad tracks, and it's criminal trespassing to even be on a railroad track or to cross railroad tracks. And reason for that is that it's extremely, extremely dangerous. People get hit by trains all the time because they don't ever think that they'll get hit by a train. And so they'll just be sort of wandering on the tracks and get hit, especially by the commuter trains, which are very, very quiet. And so I would do a lot of educational contacts. I would go out and do presentations to schools or various other police departments talking about safety around railroad tracks.
How fun.
It was really cool. And then a lot of it was protection of resources as well. So the railroad, I would tell people to imagine it's like a gigantic city. It's just really narrow and it's sort of spiderwebbed in and out of other cities. And so all the problems that you would have in a normal city, plus some, are going to take place on railroad property as well, because you have a lot of people who like to live on railroad property in homeless camps, and you have people who want to come onto the railroad property and steal things, mostly to do with metal, or to break into the train cars and steal big screen TVs.
When they're parked, when they're just sitting.
Exactly. So all that type of stuff, anything that had to do with a train or a train track, I would get a call for.
Is there a lot of transportation happening? Like you said, TV screens, that they're moving goods?
Every single thing that you have in your home at one point was probably on a train. It is remarkable. Like mass quantities of. So what happens is the trains will typically arrive from maybe Chicago, for instance, or the trains will be built at the port and they're picking up containers, and then they go to an intermodal yard, and then the intermodal yard will send out all of those containers to the different warehouses where the product is getting distributed. So for instance, I remember I had a call once about a container that the seal was broken on, which means that I have to go check it out and make sure that nothing has been stolen from that container. And I opened up this gigantic container and found that it was completely full of K-cups, those Keurig K-cups. So imagine a container truck, like a full-size tractor trailer filled with K-cups. I mean, it was probably, I would say, if I had to guess, probably over $1 million worth of K-cups in there.
Oh my gosh.
So you think about...
Just think about the trash. I don't like those K-cups.
Oh, me neither. They're horrible. But like those are the types of things that would be transported, and rail is super efficient. Instead of having, hundreds and hundreds of trucks driving on the roads, you could have one train carrying the same amount of product to get back and forth across the country. In fact, all of our cars that we get at dealerships, those all arrive on trains too. It's pretty cool. I mean,
and is there a lot of theft then? Like you found this broken seal. Yep. Obviously, all the product was there.
It was there. There are also high value loads that will have like alcohol in them, for instance. And
there was security for that.
Yeah, and we'll inspect those to make sure nobody breaks in, but obviously people do. So people break into that, or people will steal metal because the railroad uses a lot of metal. And so people steal it and try to take it to a scrapyard.
Like from the tracks?
Yeah. They'll just steal, or like, copper wire. If that's just laying around, that'll get stolen. The railroad owns a lot of equipment as well, and people just try to steal stuff. So we would get calls like that all the time.
Did you have to make a lot of arrests personally?
Yeah, I would say most of them were trespassing related, but every once in a while you'd have a trespasser who would have like a felony warrant out for his or her arrest. And so you would then have to bring that person to jail.
Were you with anyone else? Did you have a partner? Or would you have to handcuff the person?
A lot of the times I was by myself because there's not many railroad cops. It's a very, very small department, but we were dispatched by the Port of Seattle police. And so if I was ever in a situation where I was having to take somebody into custody, I would be contacting the locals and like letting them know that I'm doing something so that I'm not totally alone, putting myself in unnecessary risk. So it was a very interesting job.
Was it scary? Did you have a lot of scary moments?
There were moments that were scary because I was alone. It was night. I was sometimes climbing around on trains and in dark places, totally alone. But I always thought that I could, if you sort of use your brain properly and really trust your instincts. Like if something didn't feel right, it was never worth it for me to continue. And so I never had hesitated to back out of a situation that felt weird to me. So
I'm so fascinated by it. Is it weird that I'm fascinated?
No, it is fascinating. I mean, it really is like a train wreck. It is a fascinating job because nobody really even knows that railroad policing exists.
Didn't even know.
Yeah. And the railroad police are actually one of the oldest branches of law enforcement in the country. So there's a lot of history with the railroad cops. And it was a really, really fun job. I did it for about 5.5 years. I would say towards the end of it, I was not very happy because again, I was focusing on what I didn't want and
you had other things
complaining about my schedule and the like. But there were some moments at that job where I was riding around on an ATV on railroad tracks, or near the railroad tracks, like patrolling, and just couldn't believe that I got paid to do something so much fun.
Oh my gosh. And you had mentioned when we were chatting prior to recording, you had mentioned something about a lot of hobos. And we're not talking 1920 here. We're talking, just a few years ago. There are still people who are hoboing it, right? Who are jumping on cars.
It's a whole culture out there of hobos.
I heard a podcast. I've been trying to get her on the show. I heard a podcast with a woman who spent a bunch of time, just hopping cars. And maybe that's part of my fascination with this whole thing, because I see it as a mode of transportation, a mode of travel, right? And I probably have this fascination of like, I wished I lived in 1920 so I could be one of those hobos with a little pack on my back.
Right.
The stick and
now it's a little different. It's a pretty dirty way to travel, a pretty unsafe way to travel. We have a lot of hobos that fall off of trains and don't make it.
So are there actually open cars where people can jump on and they fall out of those?
Typically there's not many open cars anymore. Most of the cars, the doors are going to be closed. I would say that sometimes people will ride in a well car or something like that, but there are other cars.
What's a well car?
So a well car is a car that you would put containers into. So it's basically just a car that, if you imagine a crane lowering containers.
Okay, so it's like a shell kind of.
It's like a shell. And so there's just a lot of places where people can sort of fall out the bottom of those. And so the logistics of it, in addition to it being illegal and the repercussions of being caught being a pretty hefty fine, the sort of safety that you would, it's just a very dangerous environment with a lot of very heavy moving parts, and a lot of people get hurt.
So it is a subculture. Is it like young people, or is it homeless people?
It's a combination of, I would say, young and homeless and just sort of travelers. I actually have met some really great hobos, and so I have nothing against them. Obviously,
except for the safety.
Right.
Yeah,
obviously, it was my job to not allow them to do it. But I also had some really, really great conversations with some of them. And they
young people just trying to get from one place to another.
Yeah, and they just wanted this cool, interesting lifestyle and traveling and sort of doing this adventurous thing. And I remember pulling some train riders off in Monroe one night, and it was these two relatively young girls, and they had come up and over Stevens Pass, and it was pouring rain, and it was probably 40 degrees out. And I don't think they've ever been so happy in their life to see
to be arrested.
And I don't even think I arrested them. I think I took them to Denny's to dry off because they were so soaked and cold. What I found is that if you really sort of treated people with respect, they were always really, really nice to me. And so I loved all the different people that I got to meet through that job.
So it wasn't necessarily a dangerous outlaw culture or a gang culture. It was more just good people doing something different.
For the most part. There were definitely, we had some murderers traveling the rails. So you always, as a police officer, you never know who you're dealing with. And so you would always assume the worst, hope for the best.
Right, for your own safety.
For my safety. Mm-hmm. And we definitely there was some culture within the railroad that was definitely not very healthy. But I would say the majority of my contacts were totally benign and really nice people.
And you mentioned kind of a little bit of PTSD of having seen so many deaths. Mm-hmm. And that was people, were those deaths reported and you had to go check them out? Like somebody found a body and then you had to go?
Usually the train conductor or the engineer would report that they had hit somebody. So they typically would know. There's a few instances where they didn't know because somebody ran into the side of a train with a car or something like that. And so they wouldn't know that because the train is so big that it doesn't get affected by a car running into it. And then the person would die later. But usually it was somebody trespassing on the railroad tracks. Occasionally it was a suicide. More often than not, it was an accident. So somebody just on the tracks, not paying attention, and Amtrak comes around the corner going 80 miles an hour, almost silently.
The conductor can't stop.
They can't. I mean, They can, but it takes about a half a mile to a mile to stop.
Yeah. I mean, can't stop in time, I should clarify.
Correct. Yeah. So when you're going 80 miles an hour, there's very, very little you can do. And so typically I would get a report that a person had been hit at such and such a location, and then I would have to respond to that scene and be there for the whole event, basically, until we had cleaned everything up and left.
Was it totally gruesome?
Absolutely gruesome. Like, I would say it was so gruesome that your brain almost couldn't believe it was real. And so I often felt like I was in a movie set, is the best way to describe it. And I think that that's just a self-protection mechanism. What's really interesting, I think, is that when you are in the presence of somebody who's been hit by a train, if I were just wandering around in the woods and I came across a body, like, my cortisol, my stress hormone, obviously is going to go up, and I'm going to be on edge and alert, because if somebody just got hurt, I'm starting to look around and get suspicious of, like, okay, what happened? Do I need to be worried for myself? Now, obviously, if I see somebody who gets hit by a train, I'm not worried that a train's going to come out of nowhere and hit me. But that same physical reaction happens in your body. And so that stress hormone is flooding your whole body, because it's not natural to see this, and it puts you on alert. And so for days and days afterwards, you handle a fatality. Had you been on the scene of one, you would have looked at me and thought, oh man, that girl, she's got it together. She's like sharp, and Johnny on the spot, like, has no problem. And in the moment, I was totally fine. I felt nothing. Usually I was just doing my job, and I would do really well. I would be really good with the family members, but then I would get home and it would be a different story. And I would often, like, break down or have nightmares. And then that was sort of like the struggle bus after the incident itself.
Would you have to stay on site for a long period of time?
It would, for a fatality to be cleaned up, I would say it was hours, because the local police department would have to come out and they would be doing the primary investigation. And then I would be there mostly as a liaison.
Got it. So it wasn't like you could report it in, call in the locals, and then go back to your
Oh,
work.
no. I was definitely there for hours.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Ooh, sorry to hear that. Yeah, that's got to be tough. Sorry to put you through that, but that's another.
No, I really feel as though working through those moments is what led me to discover meditation and really get interested in mindfulness and, like, being in the present moment, because it's easy to be in your head when you're thinking about something traumatic that's happened, and it's easy to just keep replaying that over and over again and, like, hold on to that trauma. And it was through those experiences that I sort of found meditation. And I think if I could look at one skill or habit that I could impart on anybody else on the planet, one thing that has really helped me sort of continue forward as an entrepreneur and just to stay centered and grounded, it's a meditation practice.
What kind of meditation practice do you have?
So I will do a meditation every day. It's nothing crazy. A lot of times it's just sitting with my eyes closed, listening to my breath and just coming back to it over and over again. Sometimes I'll listen to a guided meditation.
Do you have an app that you use?
I use Insight Timer.
Mm-hmm. I use that too.
Yeah, I use that every day. Or I do a lot of hiking, spending time outside, and I'll try to incorporate some sort of a meditation into that. And then I'm a violinist, and so I feel like music is definitely a form of meditation as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it is a good grounding experience for sure, meditation. And I know when I'm not meditating.
Oh yeah, it's so obvious to me too when I'm not.
Yeah. Oh my God. Gosh, there's still so much I want to chat about if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned, actually, to go back to a conversation that we had on the phone, you said something that I found really interesting. You said that some people have gradual awakenings and some people have radical awakenings. It sounds like you had a radical awakening when you had your accident, and that was literally a wake-up call for you. I know that some people say that it's really hard to make change unless you feel pain. You know, like the alcoholic has to hit bottom before they come out of it. But I love the fact that you said gradual awakenings, because I think sometimes people don't make a change because they feel like they have to wait until the very worst happens before they can, there has to be so much pain before they can make that change. Yeah. But I've always believed, I don't think that I have had, I can tell you terrible things, bad situations or whatever in my life. And I can refer back to that and say, yeah, and now I do this because I had that experience. But it's not it's not a near-death experience.
Right.
It's all been gradual. Mm-hmm. It's all a process. Life is just a process. And I think that's a really important message to tell people, know? And I think, do you kind of follow that in your coaching practice when you work with people?
Right. Yeah. Because everybody is going to have their own process of self-discovery. I could sit here and lay out exactly what I did and give that blueprint to somebody else and tell them, do this. And they aren't going to necessarily have the same results. So it's sort of allowing life to awaken within each of us on its own. And that is a gradual process. And it's exciting to watch it in others as they start to see their evidence of the things that they're beginning to create in their life. So I have a lot of coaching clients who will sort of start feeling very unhappy with where they are. And so that's usually when they come to me, I'm unhappy where I am. And from a place where you're unhappy with where you are, you're just if you keep focusing on that, you're just going to stay there. And so my job is really just to start getting them to find a little bit of momentum going in the different direction. And then as they start doing that and they start watching things begin to unfold for them, they start to feel that things are lining up to create all the ideas that they've had for themselves. Whereas before, if they had just sat where they were and stared at things and said, this sucks and I can't do anything about it, they're just going to basically get stuck in this endless loop, basically life on repeat over and over again. And it is a very, very gradual process. I would say that even though I sort of had this radical experience between then and now, the shift in my own understanding of life has completely changed in a good way. So I think we're always upgrading our internal operating system. And if you aren't expanding, then you experience that feeling of being stuck. And so everybody does it at their own pace. I do think that suffering sometimes can be the fuel for that. And I think that unfortunately there are some people who have to go through a lot of pain, and a lot of it is self-inflicted because we are getting in our minds and causing all this turmoil with our thoughts. And it's only when you can sort of break free from that a little bit that you can start to experience relief and start to create the things that you want in your life. And I really do think that it's possible for every single person. That's the thing that excites me the most. I don't want anybody to ever look at me and what I'm doing and say, oh, that's great, Anastasia, you just got lucky and you had this really great idea and you're just talented, blah, blah. I don't ever want anybody to think that. I want people to say, hey, this girl was really, really stuck. She was in a really, really low place and she figured it out. And so I can too. And I think if you're just open to the possibilities and you don't need to know what this looks like for you, then the answers will come and find you. I think if you are sitting in a place and you say, I want to figure this out, but I need to know all the answers, then you won't find them.
Just imagine the world we could live in if people just followed that kind of advice rather than listening to the negative stories.
Yes.
Like everything that we tell ourselves that we can't do.
Yeah. I argued for my limitations for, I think, over 30 years. And told myself all the things that I couldn't do, that I wasn't that good of a violinist, or that my businesses were going to fail, or whatever it was.
And it never came out that harsh, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm making an assumption that those things never come out so harsh in our heads. They're just sitting there, and you just go, oh, yeah, violinist? No.
Yeah,
entrepreneur? No. Like, what else could I do? Okay, well, I can get a job. I can get a stable job because that's what I know to do. But can you imagine if we lived in a world where where everybody just lived more creatively and just pursued things.
Yeah.
How beautiful would that be?
Oh, if people were not sort of shackled down by the fear of things that we have been taught to be fearful of, like our health insurance or, 401ks or, whatever it is. I mean, there are people who are literally killing themselves to stay at a job that they can't stand.
Right. In hopes of retiring.
Yeah. And then they retire and something horrible happens.
I know.
And so it's like, I don't think anybody came onto this planet to just sort of live life on autopilot. And I sort of look back and realize that that's what I did for 30 something years, is I just sort of head down, shoulder to the wheel, just sort of go through the motions, like wake up, go to work, eat, sleep, do it again. And I just sort of like lived for the weekend. And I finally had just sort of had enough of that. And I thought, wait a second, like, why can't I do something really cool? And why can't I bring more life and more light into the world through allowing these ideas to flow through me without needing to know how they're going to work out? And when I finally just let go and it was like I found the feeling of that inside me, and then I just let it go. And then all this really cool stuff happened. And I watch time and time again people go through that and they find that feeling and then they let go a little bit. And then it's like in the letting go of needing to know all the answers, it's like you've created space for the answers to sort of trickle in and find you. And I just love that.
Mm-hmm. I want to cry because I just love all those words. It's like just so spot on. It's just amazing.
Thank you.
It's just totally resonates with me. So thanks for sharing all that. So right now, your main focus, it's Kula Cloth for sure, but you're also doing coaching work. Are you pretty active with with having clients right now?
I do. So I have a few private clients that I work with. I would say most of them sort of identify as an adventurepreneur or somebody who wants to sort of pursue something and they also simultaneously have a love of the outdoors. I don't usually, I only take a few private clients at a time just because I like to put a lot of energy into them. And with everything else that I end up doing, if I had like 30 clients, it would not be fair to any of them. So in the past, I've taught a group class called Stuck to Summit. And I'm in the process of working with a woman that is also a coach to sort of create a little program around that so that we can work together and she can sort of help me with more of the coaching side of things. Kula also is hosting 2 events this year. So we hosted one event last year called Kula Palooza. Mm-hmm. And this year we're hosting 2 events. One is called Spoken Wild and one is called Kula Palooza. We're doing that one again in October. And I teach vision boarding and sort of coaching classes at those different events as well.
Where are they?
Both at the North Cascades Institute.
And where is that?
It is up by Diablo Lake up in the North Cascades National Park.
Nice. How many people can you handle?
So we are allowed to have 100 people on site. So that includes instructors. So I'm not totally sure how many spots we have for participants. It'll probably be somewhere in like the 75 to 80 range.
Mm-hmm. Are those tickets on sale now?
The Spoken Wild is. Yep. We just opened up registration for Spoken Wild and we're simultaneously launching a print magazine for Spoken Wild. So that's sort of crazy as well. But I really feel like all of that aspect of the side of the business is all a part of Kula Cloth. But it's like, to me, that's the most exciting part because Kula is really great. And Kula is sort of what was born through me as a result of me going through this deep dive into myself and sort of allowing an idea to flow through me and to watch it sort of come to life before my eyes. But I understand that process now and I can articulate it and I help people through it in their lives. And so that is something that really excites me, is like using this beautiful product and platform of Kula to help others make similar changes in their life, whether they want to start a business or they just want to maybe get out and go hiking more or try something new or learn a new skill or just reconnect with themselves for maybe the first time ever. That is sort of what I want to create through those events. And I have a really fantastic woman that I work with named Allison, who's helping me with the event side of things, because I had never planned an event until last year. And in fact, I did not actually plan it. Allison, I feel like I'm sort of I have a lot of ideas, and Allison is sort of the one who knows how to take ideas and put them together into something that works. So
exciting.
Yeah.
And so they're in October, or?
Spoken Wild is in June, and Kula Palooza is in October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Good luck with that. And I'll link to those in the show notes as well. So, one thing that I want to chat about, and as we've talked, you have mentioned your violin playing. Can you talk about this really amazing thing that you do? There's a fantastic article in Outside magazine that I read that encapsulates it really well, and I'll link to that. But would you describe what you and Rose do together?
Yeah. So my musical partner, Rose, and I are a small duo called the Musical Mountaineers, and we climb mountains with a violin and a piano. It's a keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
It's a keyboard. And we perform unannounced sunrise serenades for nobody. So we started doing this in 2017 just to fulfill a mutual dream of ours. We met through a very serendipitous series of events through social media, and we found out that we had this mutual dream of bringing our music into the wilderness. Decided to do it. Decided to wear gowns and do it. And we had no expectation of this ever becoming anything. And we filmed one little video and shared it. And we were very, very unprepared for the response.
Which video was that?
It was our video of Ashokan Farewell.
I saw that one, yeah.
Standing on these rocks, barefoot.
I was going to ask, are you barefoot in that?
I was in that. It was a very warm day.
Oh, it looks like snow.
There might be a few Ashokan.
It looked like you were standing in snow, but
yeah.
I'm glad to know that you weren't, because I thought, is she barefoot? Oh my God.
If it was on snow, I promise I wasn't barefoot.
Okay.
So we just really sort of organically allowed the Musical Mountaineers to become what it wanted to become. And that experience of playing music in the wilderness is something, it's hard to describe it. It is sort of this intense meditation, and you're just very, very intensely present, because a lot of times your fingers are so cold you can't feel them. And so there's a lot of factors that go into, it's this very, very physical act of hauling an instrument up into the backcountry and then taking it out, and now you're just going to play music for nobody. And it has really been the fuel, I think, to what I do with Kula Cloth, because when you're out in the backcountry playing music, you are just in this space of like infinite possibilities. It's like the most extreme amount of abundance you can ever sense in your life is like being out in nature. And then you come back to the world and it just seems like all things are possible. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I sort of look back on all these crazy Musical Mountaineers trips that Rose and I did. And I realized that I would, through the process of creating Kula, I would go through all these worries and fears and doubts and, just being terrified if what I was doing was crazy. And then I'd go out on a Musical Mountaineers trip and all those worries would just sort of evaporate. And I'd come back and I'd make more progress. And then I'd get scared again. And then I'd go back out into the mountains and play more music. And so it's just been this sort of cycle of like coming back to this music over and over again. And we still do it. We've had the opportunity to perform music for Backpacker magazine and for Merrill Shoes. We performed at REI, and we were featured in the She Explores podcast and in the She Explores book. And we've performed a few times at Benaroya Hall, which, had you told me 5 years ago that I would be playing on stage at Benaroya Hall, I would have just laughed at you. I definitely did not think that that was possible for me. And I think after my accident, it was sort of I was so much more open to things like, oh, everything's possible. If you say I'll never perform at Benaroya Hall, well then sure, of course you won't. But if all of a sudden you're just open to where could this go, then things have a way.
And it doesn't even have to be specific, like,
No.
because sometimes I think that when we try really hard, like if you had the intention of performing at Benaroya Hall and said, one day I'm going to perform there, it may never have happened.
Exactly, because it's too specific.
Yeah. But like you said, you use the words,
open.
just being open to it. And then what unfolds is like, it just takes you on this trajectory.
It does. And so we've been able to perform benefiting national parks now, and it just has led us to so many really beautiful experiences. And so we still go out. We just went snowshoeing couple weeks ago. It was 16 degrees and we managed to play a few songs remarkably.
At sunrise?
At sunrise.
Always at sunrise. So you must leave it like, well, now it's winter, right?
We
so
had
you can
left,
leave at 6.
We left at 2. We woke up at 2 a.m. because we had to be at the trailhead by around 5 to make it up by 7 because we're moving a little slower because we're carrying so much stuff. But it's a really beautiful experience, and I just look forward to seeing what happens next with the musical Mountaineers.
That is so cool. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
That is really neat. Anything else that we should cover? I know we've covered a lot. We've kind of touched upon
I love
stuff.
it.
One thing I will say, just to go back to your musical Mountaineers, is that the quote in Outside Magazine that really was a highlight for me was something that you said. People say it's particularly emotional because they aren't prepared for it. So you're not making announcements,
correct,
to let people know. You just go out there. If nobody's there, great. If somebody's there, great. Yeah. So people say it's particularly emotional because they aren't prepared for it. I love that. I live for moments that feel like an unpromised gift. Yeah. Isn't that neat?
Yeah.
Can you imagine if we just all, like, to go back to that idea of if we all lived in a world where people were pursuing art and just creating things and having that belief and giving each other unpromised gifts.
Yeah.
How amazing.
It would be so cool. And I feel like so many people, you will, maybe they like art, but then they'll follow that up very quickly with, but I'm not that good. And, instantly shut themselves down. And I look at the best, most successful artists in the world, and they're the people who aren't telling themselves those stories. There are people who literally make a living drawing stick figures. And I just hope that people can be open to the fact, like, each of us has this unique gift inside of ourselves. For me, it's been Kula and musical Mountaineers, and, it just sort of continues to grow into whatever it is. It's like the life uses me to express itself in this really cool way. And so I hope other people can ask themselves the question, like, what is that expression of life that wants to come through me? Maybe it's stick figures. Maybe it's jokes. Maybe it's something totally ridiculous. Maybe you love to knit, but you tell yourself, well, I couldn't make that into a business, right? There are people making millions of dollars on knitted goods, so it's like, follow those little impulses in your heart, even if it seems crazy, and just see where it goes. You literally have nothing to lose.
Right. And the thing that strikes me about Kula Cloth too, is that someone might say, I can't make money, with a knitting company. You didn't even know how to sew.
Yeah.
Yet you felt such a deep belief in what you wanted to create that you taught yourself how to sew. You learned how to sew, and you sat, like you said, for hours and hours sewing until you figured it out.
Yeah. You can always figure everything out. And I think it just starts with being open and not shutting yourself down and just saying, this is possible and I don't know how, but I'm excited to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a new book out called Everything is Figure-outable.
Yeah. And it's so true.
It is. So I end these conversations with guests by asking, what does it mean to you to be bold?
I think what it means to me to be bold is to listen to yourself and allow the ideas and the inspiration that you have inside you to really shine. So if you have an idea, don't shut it down instantly. If you feel a little impulse to do something, don't tell yourself that it's not possible. Take a tiny little action. It doesn't have to be something big and crazy. You don't have to go out and start your LLC tomorrow. But you can take one tiny little step. And I feel like it's like that one tiny little first step that you take is sometimes the boldest of all of them, because it gets easier and easier as you start going down the path and things start showing themselves to you. But I really feel like that first little step, where maybe it's just being open to what's coming to you, and saying, hey, there is something more out there for me. And I'm just going to be open to what that could be. And then when an idea comes, instead of shutting yourself down, you just do one little thing, or maybe reach out to somebody and ask a question. I feel like it's those tiny little hidden moments that ultimately, if you're consistent with them over time, they add up into something really big.
Yeah, that's a good point. The consistency of it.
Yeah.
And just coming back to it and coming back to it and coming back to it.
And I also think that everything that it sounds so cliche, and I used to hear people say this, and I would sort of, my gag reflex would kick in, but they would say like, everything you need is inside you right now. And I didn't understand what that actually meant. And I now do understand what that means. And it's not actually cliche. It's actually true. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like finding the feeling of what you want to create. And so if that is this big, bold vision for yourself, like allow yourself to have that dream and find that feeling now. And then when the ideas start to come to you, you do something. And I think that would be a really cool world to see what if everybody really listened to themselves, like what could we bring into the world?
Yeah, as they say, you have to get out of your own way.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's so true.
Yeah.
And you don't know what that is. Sometimes you don't know what that is.
Yep. You just have to take the first little step.
Yeah, exactly. Where can people find you?
Oh my goodness. I'm all over Instagram. So Kula Cloth is just at Kula Cloth, Kula, and then the word cloth.
Do you have people post photos of not really using it,
but
having their Kula Cloth out, like in
the
wilderness?
And Kula Cloth Instagram is sort of a community of its own. It's my sister and I do all the content, and it is literally the funniest thing.
Oh, really?
Oh, we have like loyal fans that love it.
I'm going to participate.
Oh, it is so. If you want to laugh, that is our goal, is to make people laugh. So Kula Cloth, my personal Instagram is just at Anastasia.Allison. And then the Musical Mountaineers.
Allison with 2 L's.
Allison with 2 L's. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then the Musical Mountaineers is just at the Musical Mountaineers. And then you could also find Kula Cloth on its website, kulacloth.com. And then you could also search on YouTube for the Musical Mountaineers and watch. We have well over 100 videos of us performing music in the backcountry on there.
And then you have your own personal website with your coaching as well.
And that's just AnastasiaAllison.com.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Oh my gosh. Thanks so much for coming over.
Oh my God.
Appreciate
Thanks for having me. This was so much fun.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah. Thanks so much. Isn't she great? If you enjoyed that, you might enjoy my conversation with Nicole Doan, a trauma nurse, canyoneer, and also the survivor of a near-death experience. Now, Nicole was on episode 101. You can find that and all of my other episodes at shesboldpodcast.com/episodes or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to support the show and let me know how much you are inspired by these conversations and how much you look forward to hearing the uplifting stories from my guests, go to patreon.com/bebold. Patreon supporters get to submit questions for me to ask guests and become part of our private Facebook group, and that is ladies only. They also get access to bonus content, including questions I ask of the guest. Now, this week, you'll find out about Anastasia's search for something that she treasures greatly, and that's the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe. To keep up with me and all of my travels and my running, you can connect with me by friending me on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram at both Beth Whitwa, BETHWHITWA, and Wandergal. Feel free to leave a message or question at 877-280-5170. I really do love and appreciate feedback. You can also email me at beth@shesboldpodcast.com. And I should mention that I'm starting to get some ideas from listeners for future deep dive episodes with Chris Fagan. So if you have suggestions for topics, please let me know. Ladies, you can join the Be Bold Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/BeBoldGroup for support and encouragement for whatever ways you're trying to be bold. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. And until next time, be bold.